All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. AJ Bond, the shame educator, podcaster, and now author, has returned to the Stoa. And AJ just released a new book, Discomfortable: What is Shame and How We Can Break Its Hold. And for those of you who know, AJ was our shame educator here at the Stoa, doing his shame breakthrough bootcamp for about 10 months. And week after week, he was doing his workshops on shame at the Stoa. I think he single-handedly got me and the rest of the people at the Stoa through the first phase of this intense pandemic. So there's a lot of gratitude for myself and people at the Stoa for AJ. So how today is going to work is going to be a 90-minute session. AJ is going to read passages of his book. He's going to share his slides, present the content of the book, and we'll have a Q&A. And at the end, we'll do an exercise. So if anyone wants to purchase the book anytime throughout the session, it's right here in the chat. And I was saying to AJ before we let people in, like, I feel a sense of pride for AJ. I love the fact that, he was working on this book so hard and he finally released it. And he was saying it was a pretty magical moment when it finally came in the mail for him. So that being said, I will take AJ in. Welcome back to the Stoa, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see so many familiar and friendly faces. Thank you for coming. I was telling Peter before the session that I used to work in film and I made films, and we would have kind of like openings, and sometimes like no one would come. You'd rent a theater in Calgary to premiere your film, and like 2 people would come. And so I have a lot of like fear and shame about openings, and this like book launch it just feels so comfortable and nice to have a space like the Stoa where I feel like welcome, and I know that interesting and lovely people will come. And so I'm feeling really appreciative. And so during the whole time that I was doing Shame Breakthrough Bootcamp at the Stoa, I was writing a book about shame, and it's done. Here it is. It exists. It came out today. There's an actual book. I literally wasn't convinced that it would really happen until I got a copy in my hands. And I was like, wow, they really did it. They can't take it away now. Like, it's here. It exists. So there's a lot of like excitement and pride about it, but there's also some shame, of course. For me, explain its message. Is it any good? Will people like it? And I've already gotten like a couple reviews, and it is like a trip putting something so vulnerable and personal out into the world. So I just am really trying to name shame when it comes up for me. And so I want to name that there is some shame about the book as well. That being said, I'd love to start by just reading one page of the introduction to the book, just to like give you a little sense of the fact that it really is a book that has words in it. And I just thought this would be a fun way to start. So if you'll hear me, here is one page of the book. Introduction. Read this first. Hi. If you are reading this, I'm imagining you are a courageous person. I'm not just trying to butter you up here. I honestly believe that many people wouldn't have the nerve to pick up this book. Why? Because shame. We did our best in naming and designing this book so as not to embarrass you in public. Too much. But I still think you probably had to go through a series of hurdles to get to this point. Maybe it was overcoming the potential shame of merely picking this book up in a bookstore or handing it to the cashier. Maybe it was overcoming the potential shame of opening it on the subway or in a cafe. Maybe it was overcoming the potential shame of asking your partner for it as a birthday present. Maybe it was overcoming the potential shame of giving it to your partner as a birthday present. I approve. Whatever the moment of bravery was for you, I'm impressed and excited that you got here. And I can relate. Even to this day, after years of working on my shame, when someone asks what I do, I usually experience a tremor of shame myself as I consider whether to reveal the part about being a self-styled shame educator. What's a shame educator? They often ask. I'm not entirely sure, I admit. I just made it up. And it's true, I just made it up. But in my mind, a shame educator is basically like a sex educator, except that instead of educating people about sex, we educate people about shame. After all, though it is decidedly less sexy, I think shame ed is just as important to human literacy as sex ed. Shame is easily the single most powerful force in our lives about which we as a society tend to be the most ignorant. And that's not a coincidence. Shame wants it that way. That's why I think everyone would benefit from learning the basics of shame. The more we understand shame, the less power it has over us. That's the first page of the book. And then I also want to name that the book is slightly autobiographical. So I wanted to put all the thoughts and theories and ideas about shame that I thought were the most helpful and relevant and true. But there's also all this material in the book that's about my journey into shame, some of which is intended to be kind of light and funny, some of which is embarrassing, some of which is painful. But I just want you to know what you're getting into, that there's a lot of me in there, but there's also a lot of general shame stuff. And one side of the book might appeal to you more than the others, but it really feels like you have to put some skin in the game when you talk about shame. So that was my attempt to do that. So now I wanted to do a presentation where I give you some of the top level thoughts about shame that I think are interesting. So I'm imagining that will take 20 minutes. And then after that, we'll open it up for kind of Q&A, discussion. You can ask about the presentation or about the book or about me. And then we'll do an exercise at the end to just kind of talk about our own shame, because I think that's so important. So to begin with, I wanted to start with a little disclaimer, which is that the person who is in the best position to understand your shame is you. And I say this because part of my journey has been humbling in that when I have an insight about my shame, it's not always true for everyone. And if you're anything like me, your shame can sometimes pressure you to believe that other people know better than you do, or that they're experts and you need to do it their way. And I think with shame, it can be so empowering to realize that you're the one who understands how your shame works or can understand it. So I'm here to give you some mental models, some theories that I think are true and accurate and useful. But at the end of the day, I really want it to be the beginning of a journey for you where you start to look at yourself and your own shame and say, okay, that's some good inspiration, but what is really true from my shame? That is the most empowering. I cannot heal your shame. So this is just a way for you to start thinking about your own shame, but it's not the be all and end all. So what is shame? Most people think of shame as an emotion. And what is an emotion? I was disappointed at the beginning of this journey to discover that emotions are not as well understood as I had hoped. There are many different theories, but the theory that has had the most utility for me in terms of working with shame comes from affect theory, which was created by Sylvan Tompkins. And I mostly learned about it through this wonderful but giant book called Shame and Pride by Donald Nathanson. And in affect theory, they have a model of emotions being a combination of two things. And I find this model really useful. They call emotions a connection between feelings and thoughts. The feelings, which is what does the emotion feel like in your body, they describe as an affect. And then the thoughts are the interpretations and stories that we tell ourselves about what that feeling means. So it helps to start thinking about shame as two things as well. Shame is shame affect, which is this feeling in your body. And it's deeply connected with a cognitive component, which is what you think that feeling means. So let's start with shame affect. What does shame feel like? Generally speaking, the belief is that shame is an unpleasant sensation, universally. And a lot of people experience it somewhere between their gut, chest, throat, and face. Sometimes it can feel sort of like disgust, or it can be this awful pain in your chest. Sometimes it can constrict your throat. Sometimes it can burn your face. But it can be different for different people. So once again, it's kind of a journey for you to decide, how exactly does your shame feel? Because it could be a little bit different. But the universal part is that it probably feels unpleasant in your body. And then let's go to the cognitive component of shame. There are numerous different ways that you could interpret this unpleasant shame affect feeling in your body. I've been kind of collecting shame words, and there are many of them, and they're all quite unpleasant. But of all these different interpretations, I kind of distill it down to different, bad, and alone. So when I feel shame affect, and this is true for a lot of people I work with, they feel an unpleasant feeling in their body, and their brain has a story that feeling means they are different from other people, they are bad in comparison to other people, and they are or might end up being alone because of that. But the cognitive component of shame, again, can be quite different depending on your culture and your upbringing. So there are different ways you can interpret shame affect. And one of those ways brings up a very popular distinction that Brené Brown talks about, and you've probably heard. It's the distinction between guilt and shame. And in Brené Brown's definition, guilt means I did a bad thing, and shame means I am a bad thing. But when you look at guilt and shame through the lens of affect theory, it suggests that in a way they're kind of the same. That guilt is the same feeling, shame affect, but the interpretation is, oh, when I feel this, I did a bad thing. Whereas shame, the same affect, the same feeling, but with a different interpretation. I am a bad thing. So I was inspired by my mentors at the Center for Healing Shame, Brett Lyon and Sheila Rubin, to not use this distinction of shame and guilt as if they're like completely different emotions, but instead to honor that the ways in which we work with shame can be healthy or unhealthy. So they use the distinction of toxic shame versus healthy shame. And I think this is really powerful because it shows that it's not shame itself that's the problem. It's about how we think about it and interpret it that is often what makes it maladaptive versus a healthy kind of self-awareness. So I want to look at what those kind of big distinctions are between toxic shame and healthy shame. When you're in toxic shame, it tends to be an interpretation of shame that is global, permanent, and externally referenced. So I feel globally bad. My whole self is bad, and I'm going to be bad forever. Like there's just something about me that is wrong. And it's often informed by other people's opinions. In comparison with them, I am this permanent, globally bad thing. But when you reinterpret shame affect into a healthier interpretation, you can actually corral it into something that's very specific. This unpleasant feeling was caused by a specific event. And like all emotions, it's actually temporary. And you can even see the badness itself as temporary, as something that you can make amends for, that you can heal, that you can fix. And it's much more empowering when there is an internal reference, which is to say, you're the one who decides whether you actually made a mistake or did something wrong. Another way you can carve out this distinction is to take something like different, bad, and alone and reinterpret it as, well, wait, everyone feels shame. So I'm not different, I'm the same. And if everyone feels shame, we can't all be bad. It must be that I'm normal. And instead of meaning that I'm alone, you might actually discover that it makes you one of the people. And that actually by talking about shame, you might be able to get more connected. And instead of being rejected, you might find yourself with a stronger sense of belonging. So there's this really powerful different ways that you can interpret shame. But the question is, why do we interpret shame in a toxic way to begin with? Like, where does this come from? I think that it's a double whammy of nature and nurture. I think that there are instinctual reasons for why shame comes up that kind of push us towards the belief that we're different, bad, and alone. And we'll look at those in a moment. But another big component is cultural conditioning or childhood conditioning. Some people call this acculturation. And as I understand it, it's important to honor that humans are unique among the animal kingdom in that we are born with brains that are not completely finished. And that allows us to be incredibly adaptable and flexible, more so than almost any other animal. So we are born and we look around at the world that we find ourselves in, and our brain starts to wire itself to that world. Not just the physical world, but the cultural world, the norms and rules that we see in our family and our friends and in the media. Our brain literally wires itself to those messages. And part of the messaging that it starts to wire in is what different emotions mean. So as a child, you might feel this unpleasant feeling of shame. And then you look at the context, you look at why it comes up, you look at what people say about it, and you get this ingrained belief. Oh, when I feel that, it means I'm different, bad, and alone. And that ingrained belief is not like a casual opinion that sits in your logic center that you can kind of just throw away. It really becomes almost like your first language. It's so fundamental to your sense of reality that you actually think in it. You see the world through it. It's the water we swim in, to quote David Foster Wallace. So cultural conditioning is something that I look at as a chronic condition that I have to accept and work around rather than trying to wrestle against and deny. So that's a big part. The other thing on the kind of instinctual side of why we see shame the way we do is that we are inherently a social animal. And I can't stress enough how profound and fundamental being a social animal is to shame and to being human. We kind of just take it for granted. Like, of course, we want to hang out with other humans. But not all animals are social. There are solitary animals, like most wildcats. And their emotional system, I'm not an expert on wildcats, but their emotional system, I imagine, is calibrated in an inverse way to ours. Because our emotional system is all about motivating us to belong to a pack, because that is the safest way for a human to survive. So shame, when it comes up, is almost always inherently socially referenced. So when we feel it, it makes sense that it's in this comparison that says, oh, I must be different, bad, and alone. Another way that shame is believed to function, and this also comes from affect theory, is through expectations. So our brain seems to create an identity about us that has these expectations of what we can do, who we are, our competencies, how other people should treat us. It's kind of like predictions and hopes for the perfect AJ. And in affect theory, it is believed that our body produces shame whenever we don't live up to this expectation that we have of ourselves in our mind. And this expectation is informed by our social nature. So we inherently have an expectation burned into us that says, I should belong. So when that expectation isn't met, we feel shame. But we also have all of these somewhat arbitrary cultural expectations. Like for me as a child, I had an expectation that I would be straight. And when that expectation wasn't met, it produced all this shame that said, you are not the thing that you thought you needed to be in order to survive. And I think that when we feel an expectation and then look at the reality and they are different, our brain is inherently making a comparison. This is why shame is so bound up with comparing ourselves to others. Because in our brain, the original source is a comparison between us and this perfect sense of ourself that we think we need to live up to survive. So it inherently creates a kind of hierarchical comparison that says, this expectation is what I thought I needed to be and what I thought would lead to safety and comfort and survival and pleasant emotions. But my reality is something else and it feels awful. So it's really easy to slip into this belief that when you feel shame, you really are lesser. And there's another you who could have done better, that's superior, that's above. And we start to expand this viewpoint, not just on ourselves, but on everyone. We start to look at other people and say, who's above me? Who's below me? And we don't just do it with people, like we do it with movies. What's the best movie? And this is the worst movie. And this is the best book, and this is the worst book. So I contend that it is the mechanism that causes us to feel shame that kind of incepts our brain into thinking in hierarchical comparisons that you see wreaking havoc in our culture and society. So now I want to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of how shame works. And again, this comes from affect theory. And that is that shame is viewed as, let me back up a little bit. Emotional motivation. I have a model of emotions that is very simplified, and not everyone would agree with it, but it feels very true in my experience, that emotions have an aspect of motivation to them. Essentially, when we feel a pleasant emotion, it is attracting us towards some behavior that our body thinks will meet our needs. And when we are feeling an unpleasant emotion, it is repelling us from behaviors that our body thinks will undermine our needs. So it's possible that in the past, we had very simplified emotions, one of which was sort of the yes feeling. You're going to feel good if you eat food, so go and do that. And the no feeling. You're going to feel bad if you don't eat food, so avoid that. So there's this powerful polarity of human motivation to meet our needs between feeling good and feeling bad. And the reason I bring this up is that in affect theory, it is believed that the switch from feeling good to feeling bad is shame. That shame is the 180-degree U-turn that takes us from positively being motivated towards some action and then suddenly saying, oh, that's maybe not going to meet our needs, and doing the exact opposite and being repelled. And the way that shame is believed to do this is that they think it's an emotional attenuator, which means that it diminishes our positive emotions. In fact, I actually think it does more than just diminish them. It actually seems to invert them. So imagine this classic scenario where you're excitedly waving at a friend and you have the positive motivation of, I'm going to feel happy when I see my friend. And then you notice that that is not your friend. Your brain senses that as a potential threat to your social safety because you're acting like a fool. So it does this emotional U-turn, and it takes the amount of happiness that was motivating you to wave and smile and inverts it into pain, the pain of shame. And that is what motivates you to completely and immediately change your behavior and pretend like you weren't waving at all. So shame is the switch that overpowers an emotional force that we suddenly think might not meet our needs. Another interesting comparison is to compare shame and fear, because fear is also an emotion that when we sense some kind of threat says, hey, we need to change our behavior. And fear is when we look outside of us and detect an external threat. Let's say there's a bear. Our brain sees this bear, says that's danger, and it immediately produces this unpleasant sensation that motivates us to either fix this bear, like make it safe, or to run away from it. And I think that shame works in very much the same way, except that what it detects are internal threats. So shame scans us and says, we are the dangerous thing. Some behavior that we have enacted or some aspect about us is impacting our potential for survival, often via social inclusion. So again, shame says a very similar thing to fear. It says either change yourself or, and I think this is where shame gets really problematic, just hide it. Because so much of shame is social, if we just hide the threat from other people, that is often all our body needs to feel safe. So sometimes shame can be really motivating in a helpful way in that it tells you to change. But more often than not, it is just as likely to convince you to just hide that aspect of yourself, which may make things worse. So finally, to bring it all together, I want to compare shame to one last feeling, and that is physical pain. I think that pain and shame are both saying similar things to us when we feel them. Do not feel me. Let's say you stub your toe. Your body produces this unpleasant, painful feeling that says you need to change something in order to fix this damage that you've caused, because it might be impacting our chances for survival. And also, never do whatever it was you did again. Avoid stubbing your toe in the future. Don't do anything that makes you feel me. And I think that shame has a very similar message. When you go into shame, it says, do something immediately to stop yourself from feeling shame, AKA fix the situation or hide it, and never do that thing again. Don't do anything that makes you feel me. And the reason I think this is so key is that so many people come to see me saying, AJ, I want to feel less shame. And I'm like, that's exactly what shame wants you to want. So when we try to avoid feeling shame, when we react to it, when we run from it, when we numb it, when we push it away, we are in a way kind of doing what shame wants, which continues shame's control over us. So this is where the word discomfortable comes in. When I go to the gym and lift weights, my body creates pain, but I get discomfortable with that pain. And I say, hey, body, I know you might think this is a little bit dangerous and painful, but I know in my rational, cognitive, adult brain that it's actually going to make us healthier. You can do a similar thing with shame. You can embrace the feeling of shame, shame affect, knowing that it is a temporary emotion. And instead of acting on it, which tends to put us into all of this old defensive pattern behavior from our past or our threat response, you can actually just sit with the shame until it passes. And when it does, your brain has so much more clarity and logic about how you might actually need to react, if at all, to this shaming situation. It allows all of those old messages of your cultural conditioning to pass with the emotion. So getting discomfortable with shame is about embracing the feeling of shame so that it passes, where you can get to a state of clarity, where you can start to make rational decisions about shame that aren't controlled by shame. And I want to just note that we do not want to embrace the cognitive aspect of shame. We do not want to embrace the like, oh yeah, I am different, bad, and alone. That's not very helpful. But after you've embraced the feeling and let it pass, it is so much easier to look at the message that you're different, bad, and alone and honor that that isn't true. So that's kind of the basic core of what getting discomfortable means for me. And the book explores that and many other topics related to shame. And that is my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Well done. Enjoyable presentation, my friend. So let's pivot to Q&A. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to AJ. We already got a bunch. And I won't necessarily call you in order. We'll go with Yuli first. Yuli, you had a question.
Hi.
Hey,
Nice to see you, AJ.
Good to see you.
So let me just find that real quick. Okay, well, I'm tempted to choose between quite a few different comments I left here. Peter, if you had a specific one in mind, let me know, or just give me a thumbs up and I'll use my own judgment. Thank you. Okay, I think actually the fun thing to bring up right now is that towards my sense towards the very end of the presentation about getting discomfortable with shame and learning to appreciate it and not deny it and sort of like run away from this don't feel me impulse that might be like a very powerful story we feel. And then I would say that actually on theoretical grounds, I might imagine that some people might become somehow also oriented towards that feeling in an unhealthy way, in a similar way that maybe some people really get into some aspect of affection or experience encircling, and then sort of like return to that feeling in that specific form as something that's very nurturing and healing and warming, and then continue to sort of like seek out that specific experience. But that's actually on theoretical grounds. And while I might observe that happening in some environments in social relationships, I don't see any practical instantiations quite yet of people taking that sort of like getting addicted to this relationship to feeling shame. So let me summarize that in case it was a little ranty.
Yeah, I'm like trying to piece it together.
Yeah, and just say, so it's like if someone begins to feel their shame and then learns to feel pleasure from the affect of it, and learns to like really step into that and feel it and become nurtured by this, the strength of their experience of like, wow, I am human, I discern, I care, and this is how strong it feels, this is so beautiful. They can do that. And that can also lead to counterproductive behaviors. So that's something that I would be worried about on theoretical grounds. And then in practice, I don't think I've seen examples of this, but I thought it was worth noting. And maybe you have seen examples of this, and maybe you might have some thoughts on, is this a real worry? Is this a thing that you've seen?
Addicted to shame.
Are there things that are similar?
This is interesting. I mean, one thing that comes up for me is that it's not like shame has ever become pleasurable for me. Like shame inherently takes whatever pleasure I was feeling and flips it into discomfort and pain. So I don't know that you're ever going to get to a place where it is actually pleasurable. So I'm not too worried about people getting kind of addicted to that aspect of it, because it's more like, it's like when I'm in shame and I try to get discomfortable with it, it's sort of like relaxing while drowning. Like I have to have faith that this is safe. And I think that's a big part of working with shame, is determining, am I actually in some kind of danger here, or is this just discomfort? And when I can see that I'm just in discomfort, it's all about just trying to find as much of my bearings as I can within that maelstrom of pain. So I don't know that that would ever itself become super problematic. But I will say this, I think we are getting discomfortable all the time with problematic things. Like you might be getting discomfortable with the tedium of working a job you really don't like because you think you have to for some reason, or because you have to make a certain amount of money or something like that. Or you might be getting discomfortable with your hunger drive and not eating in order to lose weight or something like that. So there certainly are ways that we can get comfortable with discomfort that could become addictive and are not super healthy. So when I talk about using it in the context of shame, I am almost always referring to noticing that we don't always need to fit in order to survive. So I get discomfortable with my momentary, present moment, superficial urge to belong with everyone and people please everyone in order to meet some of my other needs instead, like autonomy and authenticity. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question even, Yuli?
It does make sense, and it does answer the question, but I have one follow-up. And that is that, okay, so like the version I presented with hypothetically someone stepping really into that sense of shame and beginning to even feel some sense of joy from it. And maybe Nietzsche has like done a little bit of writing on this, where he's like, the guilt would be divine, you know, as like an offhand phrase that he has used. Okay, so maybe you're not seeing much of that. When I hear your description of shame, what strikes me as like the most useful or applicable to me is like, how do we orient to shame in a way that increases discernment? When this very natural human system is going to be kicking in for us, how do we use that in order to actually make wiser decisions for ourselves and for those that we love? Yeah. And I gave this example of an extreme example. Maybe someone gets addicted to shame, and then that might screw with their discernment. The example you gave, I wonder if it's actually on the opposite end. Like, is there something about being too passive as a recipient of shame, of not allowing it to nudge your discernment, to inform you in how to behave, to engage with that, but instead sort of like stepping back and then saying, well, I will feel into this. And perhaps that's a part of the process anyway, and a necessary part. But I also wonder, is there a part of that that you can talk about in how it nurtures your discernment? how you can get informed by your experience.
Yeah, I think like becoming self-aware, focusing on and talking about shame is radically powerful for discernment, because when you're acting on shame or trying to get out of it, it's so common that we think of shame as us. So I'll go into shame and I'll think, I really want to people please in this moment. It feels like that's me. But once you start to see shame and notice that you're in shame, you're like, oh, that's not what I want. I am being contaminated and pressured by a physiological drive, essentially. It's like saying that I wanted to yawn. It's like, no, that wasn't my conscious decision. And when I can see that, I can then notice the urge to people please and say, that's not really AJ. And I take it from being me and make it a part. I make it an object. And that is so huge for my life personally, to say, okay, I was wearing shame like a visor, but now I'm taking it off. I'm seeing all of its strategies, and I'm saying, I'm going to wait for you to pass before I decide which strategy to choose. And when you pass, there will also be other strategies outside of the limited scope of my threat response reactions, which our shame is so directly linked to survival because we're a social animal. It literally pushes us into our threat response as if there was an apex predator there. So the discernment angle, I think, is like probably the best thing you can get from noticing your shame and knowing when you're in shame. And I forget what the second question was. Could you go too far? Yes. Could you become passive? Yes. Yes. And I think this goes back to the person who understands your shame the best is you. And that is where you get into a place of discernment. Have I gone too far? Is this actually the right version for me? And that is something that kind of you have to decide for yourself. And I do think it is possible that you could get so discomfortable with everything that you do nothing. I don't know if it's super common, but it could happen. And so again, I would want to empower you to be the one to decide for yourself where that line is.
Cool. Thanks, Julie.
Well, then, thank you.
Max, you had a question.
I do. Hello, everybody. I'm calling from Australia. So thank you very much, AJ, and for the previous question. So I'm just going to keep it really personal rather than theoretical and just go, oh, I really want to work with shame with other people to understand it together. But AJ, what about if you're wanting to work with that and understand it with others, but then they're perhaps not on board with that, or they're not interested? I think about in regards to my family wanting to create a better and deeper connection. What are some of the kind of challenges you've come up against because you're working with it so deeply around looking at those kind of boundaries, and what's a realistic ability to work with it with others? If you could talk to that, I'd appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Max. That resonates a lot. Like, this all began because I had a breakthrough about shame in therapy, and I just started talking about shame with everyone. And there was a point at the beginning where I wasn't very skilled, where it was uncomfortable for a lot of people who I was really close to. And a big part of it was that they were feeling sort of blamed, like, you shamed me and my shame is your fault. And we live in a culture of shame. And, so that can definitely happen. And as I have gone on this journey, something that has been really helpful is that I've gotten into the authentic relating and circling movement. And some of the aspects of how they use language has been really helpful for talking about shame. And I'll mention one, which is ownership language. And that is really just owning my shame experience as my own and using I statements. So it would be like, I reacted with shame in this scenario. My system created shame, not you shamed me, or we live in a culture of shame. I really just tried to say, this is how it is for me. And that just allows other people to have their truth and not have to worry about defending themselves against shame. And they can then choose to join me in that type of revelation if I can keep that clear boundary between who's responsible for their feelings and who isn't. So I would suggest that you can start really lightly and gently by just talking about what interests you about shame, or what you're noticing about yourself and your shame journey. And I find that I'll like bring up shame with someone and they'll be kind of like, okay, interesting. And then like a month later, they'll come back and say, hey, AJ, I had a bit of shame. So it's like really ownership language, really focused on me and my shame, and just sort of like modeling and being open to when people are ready to kind of join you. And it is really powerful to do that work, because it does say to other people, it's okay to talk about shame. Like I was like, is it okay to talk about shame? And now I go around with that context and I say, it is okay, trust me. And that's really powerful. So that's something you could play with.
Any follow-up share question, Max?
No, not really. I just think of it in regard when you talk about opening up a space for somebody, and you know, they might bring it up later. Maybe it'll be 10 minutes when you start to share a bit more about yours or something. I think that's very helpful in terms of like the framework of the time of how the work goes. It's not like I'm going to get my response now. It's like I'm in this work to build something over a long time.
Yeah.
And others may come along.
Yeah.
So I think kind of framing is helpful, maybe. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying as well. So, yeah.
And even if people don't talk to you about their shame, I think and I hope that it's still helpful for them to just hear like, oh, yeah, he talked about his shame and the world didn't end. Oh, cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. Brendan and Becca, I'll take you in next.
Hi there. My question is, do you have any practical tips for how to be with shame when you feel it?
Yeah. This is probably the hardest part. Is I'm just like, yeah, get discomfortable with shame, feel it. Shame is so unpleasant. It is extremely difficult to just sit in it. It's literally your body screaming, do something. We're in danger, do something. And what I tend to start with is I look around and I say, is there a literal physical threat around me? Like, am I in this discomfort because I'm in literal physical danger? That's really important. And if I am not in literal physical danger, then I say, okay, AJ, this is probably shame. And it feels awful, but it is temporary. And when it passes, you will have a clearer sense of whether there really is a problem that needs to be fixed. And so there's like like some faith that I have that really stems from knowing that shame is temporary. But then on a just sort of like practical level, I go into so much self-soothing and self-compassion. I tend to be like, of course you're feeling shame. Like I treat my body like this cute little baby who just needs to like say what they need to say. And I'm like, yeah, like you got really freaked out for some reason. It felt really scary and dangerous. Like, I get it. It hurts, doesn't it? Yes. And I just try to like carve out some space to sit with it and like love it. And I find it really helps to express it in a way that might be talking about it or talking to yourself or literally just crying or sobbing it out. Sometimes I need to get angry. It's like this emotional baby just wants to be held and witnessed and given the space to do whatever it needs to do. And then it will go back to sleep. And after that is when there's like this whole world of possibility. But in the moment that it is reacting, I try not to make any big decisions. I try not to make any actions. And I try not to necessarily believe anything it's saying, but I still like want to accept it and love it, because trying to not accept it, as I said, doesn't really help. It actually might prolong it. So self-soothing, self-compassion, the faith in knowing that it is temporary, those are probably the biggest things that have helped me. And just like letting it come out, like whatever it needs to express, let it out.
Any follow-up, Becca?
No, that totally makes sense. Thank you, AJ.
Thanks, Becca.
Awesome. Ethan, you had a question.
Yeah, hi. My question was around, it seems like there's an intersection of self-esteem and shame. When you brought up some of the characteristics of shame, it kind of, that's always how I kind of viewed low self-esteem. So I'm curious, how do you approach a relationship to shame that kind of orients us towards gaining more and more self-esteem over time? If perhaps a low self-esteem is related to a certain relationship with shame that is perhaps unhealthy.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. That's a great question. So something interesting that I feel is important to note here is that, like, because my shame is so much connected to this cultural conditioning that I collaborated in as a child, wherein my sense making as a child was like, okay, like I should feel shame about these things. And when I do feel shame, it means this about me. Those messages are all still present in me. They come up all the time. So my brain is telling me, AJ, you suck on a regular basis. So that can really feel like low self-esteem, except that I don't believe it anymore. So like I've carved out some space between the real cognitive, conscious AJ in my prefrontal cortex, in my logic center, and that conditioning, which lives more in your like unconscious brain or your limbic system. And you don't need to get rid of those old disempowering messages per se in order to realize that they aren't true and to like love yourself. And in fact, I think we often get caught in this schism where we think we need to get rid of that part of ourselves in order to have self-esteem. But you can't just get rid of it. It's like trying to learn a second language. It takes years to move beyond some of those old ingrained messages. And so like, yeah, we want to go on that journey to eventually not have those old thoughts come up. But in the interim, I try to give them the same acceptance and be like, oh, I'm in shame and it's bringing up these old thoughts that I suck. But I know this isn't true. And I know that as soon as the shame affect passes, these beliefs won't even feel true anymore. So it's sort of, again, this kind of like faith and understanding that it's okay to feel bad. And it's okay to even think bad things, as long as I don't identify with it. And if I can kind of just have that, like, yeah, I get it. I know why you're saying that. That used to protect us, in fact. I accept you. I'm going to let you pass. And now I'm going to act from a more conscious place. So does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It resonated, and it feels like it's deeply related with what you said earlier around some people take the approach of like, I just don't want to feel shame whatsoever. But like perhaps a healthy is like, I'm going to feel shame. It's going to happen. So it's, yeah, when it comes up, how do I identify with it? Or
Yeah, exactly. The strategies to not feel shame tend to be what shame wants you to kind of do to try to fit in. So that's why we want to actually do the opposite and just be like, hey, shame, thanks for coming. You hurt. Okay, good night. Now I'll do what I want.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. So we got a question from J3 Guelph Street. Whoever you are, I'd like to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So my question, J3, I'm James of two other J's in the house, James and Jessica for the J3. So what role does revealing one's shame to another person explicitly play in processing shame and or healing whatever conditioning wound might be at the root of it? And in particular, what we are ashamed about, rather than just the fact that the shame feeling is alive. And actually, I have a follow-up, but I won't ask it now. So that's the question.
Okay. So I'm hearing, how does talking about shame with another person actually help to like heal that shame or change that shame, specifically in relation to the things that stimulate shame in us habitually. And I'm not like super, well, in fact, I'm very much not an expert in any kind of brain science, but I interviewed this great neuroscience educator named Sarah Payton, who some of you might have heard of. And she talks about how when we are able to express our emotions in a really precise way in front of other humans, it has a powerful impact on the connection between our conscious brain and our amygdala, which is our like fight or flight threat response center. And generally speaking, our amygdala decides when our conscious brain is allowed to be online, depending on how safe it thinks things are. But Sarah says that there's brain science research that suggests that the more we talk about what we're feeling, the more we are giving our prefrontal cortex reverse power over our amygdala. So it's kind of creating a two-way street in which our conscious, adult, mature brain has more ability to say, hey, amygdala, there's actually not a real threat here. You can chill out. So there is like some incredible healing power as a social animal to just saying what is authentically true for you and having it be accepted. And like, I can be in the worst possible feeling, but as long as there's another person there saying, yeah, that's okay, and that makes sense, and I'm that way too sometimes, the worst possible feeling becomes somehow like way more manageable and okay. And that's why when someone is reacting with shame, giving them empathy, you know, Brene Brown talks about empathy being the antidote to shame. That's why that is so powerful, because instead of like trying to help them or give them advice or cheer them up, empathy is the solution, because it says, you're with me, you're okay, and we can really handle pain together when we're okay. And as for like the trigger of shame, again, I kind of think of that as a chronic condition related to our cultural conditioning. Like for me, I am a proud, openly gay man, and I will still react with shame about like holding hands with a guy in public sometimes. And for me, that's just something that I am in acceptance with and I will talk about. And I do believe that every time I talk about it, it's chipping away at that belief a little bit. But again, it's like learning Spanish. It's going to take years. I spent 35 years, more or less, being kind of ashamed of this issue. So it's not going to heal overnight. And once I accept that, then it's a lot more manageable. So like, I wish I could say that like you could snap your finger and get rid of those old shame triggers, but I think you're much better off to become really self-aware about them and just be like, oh, of course I'm feeling a bit of shame. I'm holding hands with a guy in public and people are looking at me and I don't know what they think. Does that answer?
Yes, I think it really does address the question that I had. So thank you. Do I have capacity for a follow-up, Peter? Okay, I got a nod. I don't know if I got it.
Yeah,
anyway, so yeah, okay, great. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to ask this question without sort of loading the question to sort of like be the answer to the question while I'm asking it. But it's something like, you know, the role then of that being able to reveal shame or revealing the shame plays in the cultivation of relationships where shame is more readily shared. I think you might have addressed that previously, but in particular to the cultivation of relationships of intimacy or romantic intimacy in particular. Yeah.
Well, like on my shame journey, I literally thought you weren't allowed to talk about certain thoughts, and shame just held them completely behind a wall. And when I realized that I could talk about them in therapy, that was a big step. But then when I started talking about them in front of my friends and family, that was an even bigger step. And it's just been like a gradual process of saying to my body, hey, look, we did the thing that we thought wasn't safe and it was fine. And that's just sort of like reassuring. And not only was it fine, it often led to deeper connection. So I was just like slowly training my body that talking about shame really was okay, to the point where now it's like I want to talk about shame because I know how juicy and connective it could be. So in terms of like creating a situation where you can talk about shame with like someone like your partner, I would say that it's very likely that when you first start talking about it, you will feel sick. You will feel awful. In the moment of revealing these things for the first time, it doesn't feel good. And you kind of want to prep yourself like, this is going to hurt. And the beauty is you can talk about that in the moment. You can be like, I want to talk about like things I don't normally talk about. And it's bringing up so much discomfort because that makes it, again, easier to deal with that discomfort. I'm naming it and people aren't freaking out. And this is what I would look for. It's really uncomfortable to do. You talk about it. It feels weird. Afterwards, you might have some, a vulnerability hangover, as Brene Brown calls it. Like, oh, what did they think? But I almost guarantee that if you reflect on how you feel after that person is gone, there will be like a sense of strength and pride that will be there along with the uncertainty. And so for me, when I try to be really authentic, it's with a deep knowing that it's not pleasant to do at the time, but afterwards is the moment I can reflect on and say, ooh, it feels good to be the person who can say what is true. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, AJ. Thank you very much. And it was such a good answer. I felt less, I was feeling like ashamed that I had asked a confusing question, but your answer was great. So thank you very much.
Thank you for naming that shame.
So I just want to presence the time, AJ. We're at the top of the hour. I know we have 30 minutes left, but you have a workshop at the end. How much time would you like for that?
For the breakout room thing.
Not a workshop, yeah, breakout exercise.
Yeah, I think we only really need like 15 minutes for that. And the exercise to prepare you all for those who want to do it is literally just to talk about some experience of shame from your life. You'll be in partners, just two people in a breakout room. It's just an opportunity to talk about some aspect of your shame that feels comfortable for you, just to test it out. Like, well, what is it like? Some of you may have already done this. For some of you, it might be a little bit more edgy. So just start thinking about that, and we'll do that in maybe 10 minutes.
All right. So we have a few questions in the chat. Flavio, you had a question on circling.
Yeah. Hi, AJ.
Hey.
This is wonderful. I've found that really in circum practices, it's like I forget where my question is.
That happens all the time. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Read it for you, Flavio.
I found it. Yeah. It's a very simple question. If you're doing the circling practices, have you found it diminishes your shame propensity permanently? Because I feel it's an exercise it's really a feminine state of being where you're kind of not looking to achieve something and put on a mask. So has circling helped you have less shame permanently? And if so, well, and then the other question is like, if it has anything else also helped you? Like, I think it's essential to find these psychosocial technologies that help you push the boundaries of what is okay, because I think we need to feel a bit of shame in order to change the norms, let's say, to what we need.
Yeah, the first thing that comes up is like, I feel shame all the time. Shame is a primary emotion. It's not going anywhere. Maybe the boundaries, well, definitely the kind of boundaries of where shame will hit me hard have gone further. Like the the corral that I'm in is wider. But when I hit that boundary, shame can bowl me over as powerfully as it ever did. So I'm not like trying to get rid of shame. I don't even think that that's entirely possible. It's just one of our emotions. But circling practice and authentic relating has been huge for showing me that it is safe and okay to talk about what is authentically happening in my body in the present moment with other people. And it has brought up a lot of self-awareness. It's like, oh, wow, when someone says that, this is what comes up for me. And I know because the invitation is to share what is coming up for me. So like, if you haven't tried circling or authentic relating, I really can't recommend it enough for getting in touch with self-awareness. But other practices that have really helped, like any kind of embodiment practice has been really useful. Like somatic experiencing practitioners, like it's a form of therapy, has been really useful. Anything that gets me aware of what are the sensations that my body is producing. You know, you can notice that you're in shame often just because of the thought patterns, but it's really powerful to say, oh, my body is producing this feeling, which I happen to know is this emotion, and I am likely to go into this pattern because of it. So like any kind of embodiment practice is really, really powerful. Like mindfulness, I think, is a big part of that. Meditation, very self-aware, inducing. What else?
I think what's wonderful is that you're doing is like promoting, this is what's really wonderful, promoting kind of, I think we could be looking for a culture where we are looking for that kind of discomfort. And we are saying, if you're feeling that discomfort, you're pushing the boundaries of, you're doing something which is good for you and for others. And the same thing, I think, kind of happens with critical thinking. Like, it's not nice to have your ideas critiqued by those that you love, but it's essential to sense making. And so we need a culture that kind of tells you, you need to feel that discomfort periodically. Otherwise, there's something you're not doing everything you can to be best in a collective, you know. So I thank you for that. But I still have a question, like, how to make this culture?
How do we make that? I mean, for me, it's talking about shame. And first of all, talking about it in theory, and then talking about it, and this is the hard part for me as well, in the moment that it's happening. To be able to say, oh, I'm in shame right now, and it's telling me is really powerful if you can catch it and talk about it. And it just starts to spread. It really does. Like, I think everyone I know, it's safe to say, talks about shame more than they did before. So this kind of authenticity spreads. And that's kind of, that's a big thing, I think, to have that influence over the people in your life, where it starts to model that it's okay to talk about these things, especially if we can kind of really use that ownership language. So it's less likely to shame or blame someone else.
Awesome. And just to plug an event coming up tomorrow, embodiment was mentioned. Elan Stephanie, she's having a session on embodied sexuality. It's going to be pretty cool. So you can check that out on the Patreon website. Someone had a question about collective shame. I think it was Becca, Brandon. Would you like to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. First, I'm appreciating you, AJ, for making this part of your life's work. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you have worked with collective shame at all, either individually or in a group, and if so, what did that look like? And I don't mean working with shame collectively, like our individual shame. I mean working with the collective, the shame that the collective feels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not something that I have explored super in depth, though I have thought about it in theory. I have found it to be very powerful to get a group together and then ask, like, what are the kind of norms that this group implicitly believes in? Like, what is this context that we've all been silently living under? And just to have that kind of discussion seems to be really powerful to have, like, in your family or in your like close friend group, something like that, or even with people that you work with, to just all of you kind of name. I think we have a culture where it's not okay this and it is okay that, can be, it's like when we talk about shame or when we talk about these norms, they feel less like true and just inherently become more parts and objects that then become like, does it have to be that way? And it creates like more space. But it's definitely a topic that I'd like to explore further, collective shame, because I think that there's all these beautiful movements that we see, like Game D and sense making and circling, that are trying to disrupt our mainstream culture and create new values. But something that I notice from the past is that when those movements actually become popular and become the mainstream, they then become the dominant source of shame. And when something becomes, instead of like the radical new thing pushing against shame, but the thing that actually people want to be a part of because they want to avoid shame, it really messes with it. It's like the ultimate broken telephone moment. And I think it's that motivation again. Like when we're pushing for a new culture, we're being drawn towards the hope of feeling better. But once it becomes dominant, a lot of people are drawn to it for fear of feeling left out. So I think that there's something really powerful that we need to work out, and I haven't figured it out yet, about how to skillfully massage that shift so that a beautiful culture doesn't get corrupted by shame and become another source of shame and dominance and oppression, which I think has happened with so many beautiful movements. Does that make sense, Brendan?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thanks.
And as I said in the chat, this is why we need to bring AJ along with us during the phase shift, our shame educator, so we don't make the same mistakes in the past. Do you want to do the breakout room now, AJ?
Sure.
Or want to field one more question, or how would you like to go about it?
I think we could do one more question. I'm imagining that perhaps not everyone wants to participate in the breakout room, so that might be an opportunity for them to bow out if so.
So let's do, and we can stay a little bit beyond the bottom of the hour as well. Let's take in Tanya. Tanya, you had a question.
Hi, AJ.
Hey, Tanya.
Yeah, good to see you here.
You too.
Yeah. Yeah, my question is around supporting a child in talking about their feelings and shame. And I had an experience today where there's a 7-year-old I've been hanging out with who was here and asked me if he could hang out, and I was working and I had to say no. And then he left, and his mom said, "Oh, you know, sometimes he feels kind of embarrassed or feels some shame, and you know, we'll just go away if he feels rejected." So yeah, I was like, I went after him and told him I really wanted to hang out with him, and I couldn't. And I'm just wondering about if you have any thoughts around working with kids.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I love your story because what you modeled there was a repair. And I'm not like an expert on working with children, but in terms of children and in terms of our relationships with like our partners, this concept of repair has been really powerful to me, because it's like, oh, I don't need to get it right the first time. There's this opportunity afterwards, not only to make amends or reconnect, but it's actually the theory is that it strengthened your relationship. That even if you had been like, yeah, let's play Go Fish together, actually this moment of going back and saying, hey, I actually really want to be connected with you, and showing some vulnerability and trying to reconnect probably created more of a bond than if you had have said yes in the beginning, perhaps. So like you've already really modeled one theory that comes to mind about how we don't need to be perfect parents or uncles or even lovers or friends, as long as we remember it's okay to make a mistake. Don't go into the hiding it part of shame. Go into the like, I can do something about this. But then the other thing that comes to mind is like, again, like the modeling. I feel like I really want to model the type of expressions about emotions that my nieces and nephews might just see me doing and say, oh, I can talk like AJ does. Rather than like when I try to like get them to do any kind of, they're just like, no. But the creating this modeling where it's like, I'll talk about my shame around them or in front of them in a very just casual way. Like, oh yeah, I felt some shame about when this happened, and like that is just an opportunity for them. Like that's the information that they're taking in, I think, on a very profound level. So like I wouldn't push too hard, but you have an opportunity to model really impactful behaviors in this offhand way that just looks like appealing. That's what comes up for me anyway.
Oh yeah. That's great. That's great. Thanks, AJ.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, great question, Tanya. So AJ, would you like to set up the exercise?
So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about a bit of shame. My encouragement would be to think of an instance of shame from your own life and talk about that in a way that feels comfortable. But you can also just talk about whatever's alive for you based on this event. It's really up to you to use it how feels comfortable for you. And I encourage you to like, maybe push your edge a little bit, but not too far. Honor yourself and figure out what feels right to you to share. And the way the structure is going to work is that you'll have 10 minutes. And I will send little notes to encourage you. But basically the first minute, just like say hello and choose who's going to go first. And then one person will have 3 minutes dedicated just to them to kind of monologue and talk about their shame. And then I'll send a switch notice. And the other person will get 3 minutes to talk about their shame. And then there will be 3 minutes at the end as a kind of debrief moment where you can be like, okay, like, how are we similar? How are we different? What was it like to share that? And if you're looking for some inspiration of like how to fill those 3 minutes, I would think back to the beginning of the presentation. You could talk about how did that shame feel? That's the shame affect. What was the cognitive component? What were the thoughts and beliefs coming up? And it might even be interesting to say, like, was there an expectation of yourself that was thwarted? What was that expectation? So those are some of the things that you could explore around shame. But really, what is alive for you around shame, particularly in regards to your own shame? That's what's important.
And would you like to have host access to put people in the room, AJ, or would you like me to do it?
I already have host access.
Oh, okay. You can. I think you need host access to put people into breakout rooms. But
I've got them.
Okay, cool.
I've got everybody in a room.
I'm going to put the recording on pause.
Welcome back. I hope that was interesting. I wish there was time to talk to each and every one of you and find out what that was like. But I think we've done enough shame for tonight. So I just want to thank you all for coming and for being the brave ones who participated. And I just want to really thank Peter for creating a space where people come, and it wasn't like a movie theater in Calgary where there were just 2 people. And I feel much less shame right now than I feel like I could have under any other circumstance, honestly. So I'm so grateful that you provided this space and invited me. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. And I'll pass it back to Peter.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend, for having this session and just doing what you do. And congratulations again, like really deeply on your new book. So excited to check it out. Let's give him a round of applause for today's presentation. And just that coming back from the breakout, I just got fond memories of Shame Breakthrough Bootcamp. We gotta have another session in. So if you haven't already, you can purchase the books here in Canada and the US. Perhaps we'll have a Discomfortable book club after people have purchased and had a chance to read it, and then we can reconvene at the Stoa. So that being said, upcoming events you can check out on the website. We have a bunch of cool ones. Body sexuality, as I mentioned. Yuli, you have one on Thursday. Do you want to mention that one?
Sure. Vera Badra and I are two previous effective altruists who had spent some time at the Willow Monastic Academy and will be coming together to share a dialectic of how our experiences have interacted with each other and where we have sort of similarities and differences, and how it is that effective altruism and monasticism have both spoken to us and now show up in our lives today.
Awesome. And we're going to have an event with the Monastic Academy in Kingston, and I'll probably be there in person. So we're going to have a Super Stoa Monastic Academy event. So look forward to that. Yeah. So that being said, AJ, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thanks, everyone.